The Texas sun, relentless and scorching, bathed the arid landscape in golden light. But for Marcus, the sunlight had long lost its warmth. He sat on a worn wooden bench, hands cuffed, eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon, where freedom seemed more and more like a dream. Marcus, a black man in his 30s, with a body hardened by years of labor and a resilience forged in the streets of Houston, was not a violent criminal. His deep, expressive eyes carried the melancholy of one who had seen too much, yet also the flicker of stubborn hope. His dark skin, marked with subtle scars, told stories of a life where opportunities were scarce and choices often dictated by necessity. He wore an orange jumpsuit, the faded uniform that made him indistinguishable from many others there, but his posture, though bent by exhaustion, still displayed a trace of dignity. Marcus was a father, a son, a brother, and now a number in a system that seemed to devour lives in the name of profit. His conviction for a non-violent drug offense landed him in one of Texas's many private prisons, in a state where the prison industry thrived like a cactus in the desert. He was no major trafficker, just a fragile link in a chain of despair, trying to survive in a world that had forgotten his name. The sentence, handed down by a weary-faced judge, felt eternal. 5 years. 5 years that would stretch like centuries inside those walls. Caught in a routine operation with a small amount of an illegal substance, Marcus had sealed his fate, becoming another cog in the machine of mass incarceration for profit. He remembered the look in his mother's eyes. Sarah, a woman of unshakable faith and quiet strength, her graying hair and calloused hands telling the story of a life of sacrifice. She had promised to wait, to pray, to fight for his freedom. But on that bench, under the scorching Texas sun, Marcus felt the weight of that promise and the bitterness of his own powerlessness. The private prison, with its promises of efficiency and cost reduction, was in truth a labyrinth of inhumanity, where dignity was a luxury and hope a distant mirage. The arrival at Red Oak Penitentiary, a private facility in the heart of Texas, was a brutal shock for Marcus. The old rusted bus rattled down dusty roads before stopping in front of an imposing complex of barbed wire and watchtowers. Though the structure appeared modern, it exuded an aura of coldness and inhumanity. As he stepped down, Marcus was greeted by the barking chorus of guard dogs and the metallic clanging of closing gates. The air was heavy, soaked with the smell of cheap disinfectant and despair. The admission process was dehumanizing. A bulky guard with a face marked by indifference and eyes that seemed to have seen it all barked orders. He was Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man with a commanding presence and a permanently scowling expression. His small, piercing eyes inspected each new inmate with a mix of contempt and exhaustion. Miller was the face of authority in that system, a man who had become part of the machinery, hardened by routine and constant exposure to human misery. He appeared to have lost all traces of empathy, treating prisoners as mere objects to be controlled. Marcus was stripped of his clothes, his few personal belongings confiscated, and subjected to a humiliating body search. With each step, the feeling of being reduced to nothing intensified. He was then led through narrow, dimly lit hallways where the echo of his footsteps amplified the oppressive silence. The cells were small, cold, and overcrowded. The stench of mold and sweat was nauseating. The once white walls were peeling and covered with graffiti messages of despair and rage. The metal bunks, lacking proper mattresses, were more instruments of torture than rest. Marcus observed the other inmates, men of all ages and ethnicities, with empty gazes and emaciated bodies, hope drained from their faces. A lump grew in his throat, a mixture of fear and anger. That wasn't a prison. It was a warehouse of souls, a place where humanity was slowly corroded in the name of profit. The promise of rehabilitation, of a better future, felt like a cruel joke inside those walls. The only thing that mattered there was the daily body count, each one representing another dollar for the corporation managing that hell.
Time inside Red Oak was an elastic entity, stretching into endless hours and compressing into moments of tension. The routine was monotonous and brutally efficient, designed to keep inmates under control with minimal resources. Wake-up came abruptly, with the harsh clanging of metal bells and guards shouting, Breakfast, a bland and nutrient-poor paste, was served in rusted metal trays. Meals were moments of tense silence, where hunger and despair were the only companions. The overcrowded cells were breeding grounds for disease. Hygiene was precarious, with cold showers and rationed soap. The lack of ventilation and constant humidity created an unsanitary environment where colds, skin infections, and respiratory problems were common. Medical assistance was minimal, often denied or delayed, leading to unnecessary suffering and, in some cases, preventable deaths. Marcus witnessed the deterioration of many of his fellow inmates, their hope vanishing as their bodies wasted away. The rehabilitation programs so often praised by prison corporations were practically non-existent at Red Oak. There were no literacy classes, vocational courses, or therapy for addicts. The promise of social reintegration was a farce, a facade used to justify the system's existence. The only rehabilitation offered was rigid discipline and blind obedience. Inmates were kept in a state of forced idleness with few opportunities for meaningful engagement. The mind, as much as the body, was imprisoned, and the lack of stimulation led to apathy, depression, and in many cases, madness. Marcus, a man who had always valued knowledge and learning, felt his mind rusting, his creativity fading. He tried to read the few books available in the prison's small, dusty library, but concentration was a challenge amid the constant noise and palpable tension. In this environment of deprivation, Marcus found a cellmate named Samuel. Samuel was a veteran of the system, his skin wrinkled by time, his eyes carrying the bitter wisdom of one who had seen it all. A man of few words, Samuel's observations were sharp and laced with dry humor. Convicted of fraud, his long sentence hadn't broken him. He was a survivor, a master at navigating the murky waters of prison life. Samuel became a mentor to Marcus, teaching him the unspoken rules of that place, the codes of conduct, the strategies for survival. He was a lighthouse of sanity in a sea of madness, a reminder that humanity, no matter how much they tried to suppress it, still existed within those walls. At Red Oak, forced idleness was only part of the control strategy. The other, more insidious and lucrative, was the exploitation of inmate labor. Marcus and his fellow prisoners were forced to work in various tasks, many of them repetitive and exhausting, for meager pay, or in many cases, no pay at all. The profits, however, were astronomical. Prison corporations like Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, which managed Red Oak, earned billions of dollars annually by exploiting inmate labor. They claimed the work was rehabilitative, a way to teach discipline and responsibility. But Marcus knew it was a lie. The work wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about profit. It was about keeping cells full, labor cheap, and shareholders' pockets overflowing. Human dignity was a small price to pay for such enormous wealth. And with every sheet folded, every uniform pressed, Marcus felt the bitterness of that exploitation, the sensation of being a cog in a machine, grinding him down in the name of profit.
The private prison system, in its relentless pursuit of profit, not only exploited inmate labor, but also eroded their dignity and undermined any chance of genuine rehabilitation. The poor conditions, lack of adequate health care, and absence of educational or vocational programs created a vicious cycle of despair and recidivism. Marcus watched his fellow inmates, many of them young, enter the system with hope for a second chance, only to leave more broken, more bitter, and more likely to return. Human rights were an abstraction within the walls of Red Oak. Violence was constant, both among inmates and at the hands of guards. Punishments were arbitrary and often disproportionate, meant more to intimidate than to correct. Privacy didn't exist, and constant surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. Marcus witnessed countless incidents of brutality, humiliation, and disrespect. He saw men beaten for minor infractions, denied visits from their families, isolated in solitary confinement for days on end. The voices of inmates were silenced, their complaints ignored, their pleas for justice falling on deaf ears. The lack of rehabilitation was at the core of the problem. Instead of preparing inmates for a productive return to society, the system dehumanized them, disqualified them, and left them even more vulnerable. Many left prison with no skills, no education, no family support, and carrying a stigma that made it nearly impossible to find work or housing. The only door left open to them was crime, and the cycle repeated itself. He remembered a young man named Jamal, imprisoned for car theft. Jamal was intelligent, with a natural talent for mechanics, but he never had the opportunity to develop his skills. Inside Red Oak, he dreamed of opening his own auto shop and becoming an honest man. Marcus tried to help, teaching him what he knew about cars, encouraging him to read books on entrepreneurship. But the prison offered no mechanic courses, no tools, no support. Jamal left prison with the same lack of opportunity that had brought him there. Months later, Marcus learned that Jamal had been arrested again for stealing a car. Jamal's story was the story of many, a testimony to the inherent failure of a system that prioritized profit over rehabilitation, incarceration over justice. Amid the dehumanization and oppression, Marcus clung to small acts of resistance, fragments of humanity that kept him from becoming just another number, another lost soul in that hell. His mind, once eager for knowledge, now focused on survival, on staying sane in an environment designed to destroy sanity. He found refuge in reading, in the few books that circulated clandestinely among inmates, in the stories that transported him beyond Red Oak's walls. He read everything: novels, poetry, history books, anything that could nourish his mind and remind him that there was still a world out there, a world where freedom still existed. His resilience also showed in his ability to observe and learn. He studied the guards, the other inmates, the power dynamics within the prison. He learned to read the signs, to anticipate danger, to navigate the treacherous waters of that environment. He became a careful listener, a confidant for many of his fellow inmates, offering words of comfort, hope, and solidarity. He understood their pain, their frustration, their anger, and somehow, by helping others, he helped himself, keeping alive the flame of his own humanity. He also devoted himself to physical exercise, turning his small cell into an improvised gym. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats. Sweat ran down his body, washing away some of the filth and despair that accumulated daily. Exercise was a form of control, a way to reaffirm his existence in a place where everything else had been taken from him. It was also a way to keep his mind healthy, to release tension, to prepare for the day he would be free. He dreamed of the day he'd return to his mother, to his family, to his life. And that dream, no matter how distant it seemed, was what drove him to keep going, to resist, to not give in. He remembered the words of his mother, Sarah, who visited him regularly, bringing a piece of the outside world, a breath of hope. Sarah, with her unshakable faith, always told him that God never gave a burden too heavy to bear, and that every trial was an opportunity for growth. She brought him letters from his brothers, drawings from his nieces, news from the neighborhood. Every visit was a balm for Marcus's soul, a reminder that he was not alone, that there were people out there who loved him and waited for him. He felt his mother's pain, the worry in her eyes, but also her strength, her determination, and he knew he had to be strong, for her, for his family, for himself. The prison could imprison his body, but it would never imprison his mind, his spirit, or his hope. The years dragged on, and Marcus's release date approached, but the prison's routine continued to grind away the hope of many.
Then, a seemingly small event became the catalyst for a silent revolt, a breaking point that exposed the system's intrinsic cruelty. One of the oldest inmates, a frail man named Elias, who worked in the kitchen, became seriously ill. Elias, a quiet man with a gentle smile, had been convicted of a petty theft driven by hunger. He suffered from heart problems and was already in poor health when he arrived at the prison. Max, who knew him from the laundry, noticed Elias growing weaker, coughing constantly and struggling to breathe. He and Samuel tried to alert the guards about Elias's worsening condition, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Sergeant Miller, with his usual indifference, simply said Elias was faking to avoid work. Medical assistance was repeatedly denied, and Elias was forced to keep working in the kitchen, even with a high fever and chest pain. Marcus felt powerless, anger building inside him. He was watching a man's life fade before his eyes, and no one seemed to care. One night, during dinner, Elias collapsed in the kitchen. Panic spread among the inmates. Marcus and others rushed to help, but it was too late. Elias died, right there, on the dirty kitchen floor, without proper medical attention, without dignity. His death wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of negligence and the relentless pursuit of profit. News of Elias's death spread like wildfire through the prison, sparking a flame of revolt in the inmates' hearts. More than any other moment, that incident revealed Red Oak's true face, a place where lives were discarded from money, where humanity was treated as a cost to be minimized. Marcus felt the pain of the loss, the fury of injustice. Elias's death would not be in vain. Marcus knew he had to do something, to give voice to those who had none. That moment was a turning point. He was no longer just a prisoner counting the days to freedom. He was a witness, a survivor, and he had a responsibility to tell the truth. The flame of resistance, once just a flicker, now burned like a wildfire, fueled by Elias's memory and righteous indignation against a system that took lives in the name of profit. At last, the long-awaited day arrived: freedom. Marcus walked down the same corridors that had swallowed him years earlier, but now his steps were firm, filled with a renewed purpose. As he crossed the gates of Red Oak, the Texas sun felt brighter, the air fresher, and the smell of wet earth a balm for his soul. His mother, Sarah, was there, her eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. Their embrace was long and tight, a reunion of souls that had endured the pain of separation. Sarah, with her unshakable dignity, represented the strength of family, the hope that never faded. She had aged, her hair whiter, but her spirit remained youthful and vibrant. She was Marcus's anchor, a constant reminder that there was something good and pure waiting for him outside those walls. But Marcus's freedom was not complete. He carried the invisible scars of Red Oak, the memories of hollow faces, emaciated bodies, exploitation, and injustice. Elias's death, in particular, was seared into his soul, a constant reminder of the human cost of that system. He couldn't simply forget or move on as if nothing had happened. That place had transformed Marcus, not by breaking him, but by forging him into a man with a mission. He knew he had to use his voice, his experience, to expose the truth, to fight for those still imprisoned, to make sure Elias's death was not in vain. In the months following his release, Marcus threw himself into the fight against the private prison system. He joined human rights organizations, spoke at events, gave interviews, and shared his story with the world. His voice, once silenced by the prison's walls, now echoed in public forums, in universities, in communities. He spoke with passion, with the authority of someone who had lived through that system, with the conviction of someone who had witnessed injustice up close. He became a tireless advocate for prison reform, a voice for the invisible, the forgotten. His story, the story of Marcus, the man who survived Red Oak, became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those still trapped in darkness. He knew the battle would be long and difficult. The interests behind the private prison system were powerful and deeply rooted. But Marcus was not alone. He had the support of his family, of friends like Samuel, who, after his own release, joined the cause. He had the memory of Elias, a constant reminder of what was at stake. And he had the conviction that justice, no matter how long it took, would prevail. Marcus's story was no longer just about his own freedom. It was about the liberation of all those imprisoned by a system that prioritizes profit over humanity, incarceration over rehabilitation. It was a story of hope, of resilience, and of the fight for a future where justice belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford it. If Marcus's story moved you, if the injustice of the private prison system outraged you, then this is your moment to act. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that need to be told. Together, we can amplify these voices and fight for a fairer and more humane system. Your participation makes the difference.